Hello, beautiful community. Hello, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me as ever. And I'm sorry to be a couple of minutes late. I just stepped on my spectacles um, and had to try to fix them. Thank you so much for being here. Uh, Richard is in England. It's after midnight. Alex is in Switzerland. Humans do need to sleep at some point. Audio is great. I just got a quick super chat here from Nico, and then I'm going to go back right to the beginning because I love trying to pick out questions that folks who were early left. So let's have a go. Nico is asking, there's been a persistent narrative that Americans are using Ukraine as a tool in a proxy war. To what extent would Ukrainians agree that Americans are using them? So I think that it simply depends on how you use the term, because you could use the word proxy here neutrally. And then you could plausibly argue that it's a very good thing that a major power, in an imperial way, engages in a proxy war to defend the West against a massive escalation coming out of this sort of imperialistic frenzy that's been created in the Kremlin. And you're defending the West against that frenzy, and you are defending Ukraine at the same time from a kind of erasure. So the idea that this is an American proxy war is not necessarily a criticism of it. So the argument isn't that. The argument is that the United States is using Ukraine as a proxy, and that's bad, right? And that's an argument that I think, um, needs to be analyzed closely because it's made in different ways by different people. And I reject that argument very much because, as you know, I don't recommend policy that often, policy positions that often, but basically I recommend supporting Ukraine very strongly, and indeed stronger than we're supporting it. So I have been criticized for myself using the term proxy on a couple of occasions, but I'm comfortable with that language because what that language shows is that there is a potentially constructive and benign role in some cases for certain kinds of imperial interventions, right? And you could say that's what the United States is doing. So what you then need to do is look at the people who are saying that it's a proxy and that's bad, which is most of the people who are using that term, quite frankly, and see what's going on with them. One of the things I want to do is isolate the arguments made from the left about this and make a video on the main channel about it, just because I think that there's a kind of a real need for that, but also a real possibility to make a few generalizations about why some of the North American and West European left is not quite getting this. Because actually, if you ask the left in Ukraine, if you ask the left in the Baltic states, they're going to give you a very clear answer about the fact that we should support Ukraine. So, Nico, that's a conversation we're going to continue. Let us have a look at where we were. I think there was a question or two questions, perhaps, about that new Russian law about conscription. I saw it. I just saw it a moment ago. I'm going to answer it, and I'm just going to apologize to the person who asked the question that I can't find you again. So it's quite a significant turn in Russia. Part of this pattern of totalitarian accentuation of Russian society. What the change really means is that the burden is now on the person who's got a conscription notice to work out that that's their status, right? Before, if you weren't given the conscription notice in person, if you somehow managed to hide, even though one was written out for you, you could get away with it. But now there's going to be an electronic register, and if you appear in it, um, that's considered like you being, as it were, given the conscription notice, whether you know about this register, whether you've noticed that that's what's happened to your status or not. And then within a couple of days, borders close to you. And then within 20 days, various penalties come in if you don't act, and you're basically going to get disenfranchised as a citizen. You're going to lose the capacity to participate in society. You're not going to be able to drive. You're not going to be able to buy property. You are going to be able to catch public transport, but there's going to be a lot of restrictions. And this is significant because it's a recognition of the fact that further mobilization will have to come from segments of the population that perhaps are more resourceful around resisting it, right? And now it's going to be harder to resist. The choice is going to be basically prison or the front, unless you can, in a corrupt way, bribe your way out, which is going to be possible for some privileged members of society. This is sound thinking, in quote marks, from the Kremlin, because they're saying, look, imagine that Ukraine's counteroffensive is going well, surprisingly well for the Kremlin, and they need to react. Well, they're still going to have lots of logistical problems mobilizing people, but at least they're not going to have the problem of people just hiding and people running away. So now the people who are going to be conscripted are going to be under considerable duress. So, conscripted as in put on that formal register. And it's not a register you can get off from, so you're basically stuck. It's a significant change. Two leading Russia commentators have called it essentially a declaration of martial law. I'd perhaps stop short of that, but it's a very, very significant change that anticipates an ongoing need for the Kremlin to pick people out from the population who may be increasingly resistant to that. Let us have a look. Oh yeah, that was Alex's question. Actually, I hope this is so significant. I was actually going to do an episode about it. It's really a significant change. Christopher is saying, Vlad, I'd appreciate your thoughts on Professor Kotkin's argument that Russia will win this war as it is going at present. Christopher, I'm not sure that is Kotkin's argument. What he's saying is that Ukraine is going to have to trade territory, and that under ideal conditions, that should lead to whatever remains of Ukraine being a secure and independent state with membership of Western alliances. Again, there have been quite a few requests to talk through a couple of Kotkin's recent interventions, and I've actually printed one of them out with a view to doing that. So we might come back to this. But I don't think he's saying Russia is going to win. A question from Doge Cheney. Vlad, what do you see happening to the Russian or pro-Russian residents of Crimea should Ukraine retake it? We're jumping ahead a bit with that. There are different scenarios here. So, first of all, Ukraine could just militarily return Crimea. Now, my view has been that we need to see things on the battlefield that indicate that that's going to happen before we become excited about that as likely. So I've always warned that that is not the preponderant possibility. That is not where we're moving as far as we can see. That could change, and that has never been where we were moving, right? So that would be um, a, a possibility, but it's not a possibility that is evidently primary at the moment. Ukraine could just also um, get up to Crimea, the Crimea border, and then make certain demands and negotiate with Russia um, about the status of Crimea. That again is similar to that situation where Ukraine has an extraordinary military success. Um, then there is the possibility that um, Putin is experiences some kind of a crisis and his regime collapses and Ukraine gets Crimea that way. Then there is a possibility that eventually Putin is replaced and whoever replaces Putin gives Crimea back to Ukraine. So these are different options. And what happens to Russians living there and pro-Russians living in Crimea is going to be responsive to these realities, if any of them obtain. Now, a lot of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars left after 2014. A lot of Russians from uh, um, different parts of the country moved into Crimea since 2014. So if the Ukrainian military marched into Crimea tomorrow, there would not be a population majority greeting them as liberators. At least there's no indication to think that. Um, the commentary about this that's come out of the Ukrainian government has been mixed and part of really war messaging. So some of the messages about derussification of Crimea and holding Ukrainians accountable who collaborated with the Russian administration there have been um, not entirely welcome in Western capitals because they've sounded incompatible with European values. But I don't think you should read too much into these announcements coming from Podolyak and others. I mean, let me just put it into some context. Imagine you're a Ukrainian who actually wants to be in Ukraine, and imagine you didn't leave Crimea. And now you're hearing from Ukraine messages that you're going to be held accountable for cooperation with the local administration and that that's undefined and vague. What could you think? You would think, well, hang on. I was here living in Ukraine. A foreign power came and stole me, stole the territory that I was on. And what did you do about it, Ukrainian government? Did you defend me? No. Oh, you brought your army in to protect me, didn't you? No. You let a foreign power steal me, and now you're going to make sort of imprecise and ominous statements about how I'm going to be held responsible for cooperating with a regime from which you didn't defend me. So you see, these are complexities that come out as soon as you begin to get beyond sort of general declarations. Um, but obviously, if Crimea is Ukrainian, a lot of the Russians there will not want to be there. And exactly what happens there, we would need to we would need to wait and see. And it very much depends on the scenario under which Ukraine gets Crimea back. So that's a little bit on this. Graham is asking another question about Crimea. I mean, it's going to be a really difficult mess to disentangle, and it's going to require a lot of legal nuance and a lot of hopefully adherence to rights and human rights and some international norms. And we're going to say a bit more about that, I guess, because that's a question that keeps coming up so often. And we will end up saying more about that if Ukraine does particularly well with the counter offensive. So, Dana, thank you so much for your amazing contribution. CS79N is asking, is Tim Snyder correct when he says that fascist and Nazi are almost genericized words in Russian meaning enemy? Oh, interesting. The myth of the Second World War is very deep, actually. So it's so deep that you do think of enemies as fascists to a good extent. And interestingly, because that myth is present in Ukraine too, now it's been replaced by other myths. But when Russia invaded on Feb 24, 2022, to a lot of Ukrainians, that would have felt, especially Ukrainians of the older generation, would have felt, well, the fascists are back, right? So there is a sense in that in that part of the world that fascist has some equivalence with enemy, but exactly how much we would need to read Tim's essays and see if we agree or write our own. But there's certainly something that is not a fruitless direction. Suvara, thank you so much. Yes, I'm not able to hide. Els, of course, this is far too late for you. Let me see. Have I missed a super chat? Skyfather of the Gods is asking, was Navalny admitted to hospital and did he just receive medical attention in prison? Navalny has both had treatment withheld and he has also been deliberately, it seems to me, infected on several occasions, perhaps. So they're trying to make him sick. And he had an ambulance called complaining about acute gut symptoms a few days ago. So his situation is quite worrying, as is the situation of Karamurza in prison. And so one of the options for the regime is not just to either keep people alive or to kill them, but to create a situation where they just experience ongoing sort of physiological degeneration through this kind of legalized, quote unquote, legalized by an illegal regime, torture. Let us have a look. Graham is in Coventry. We're going to have to see, our Astra is repeating Technologics question about Prigozhin. What do you make of Wagner Group's Prigozhin telling Putin to end fighting in Ukraine? I want to get to the bottom of this. At the moment, Prigozhin is experiencing a systematic deprioritization, but that doesn't mean that he's lost this sort of access to Putin. But what's happened is that they have, milled through a lot of these Wagner folks as mincemeat. They have confiscated from Wagner this enterprise of going around prisons and picking people up from there. And so, insofar as there's been a kind of war there, the Department of Defense has won and proven to be very powerful. But I'm going to do an assessment. I'm going to do an assessment of Prigozhin's situation probably in the next week and I'm reluctant to write him off. Marv is asking, why is the dreadful war crime we've just seen, um, why is it at least superficially acknowledged by the Putin regime as wrong, as opposed to everything else? Um, well, what else? Um, uh, there's a lot of figures in and around the regime who sort of jump around and celebrate all kinds of ghastliness. Um, but um, somebody like Mr. Peskov, who is the one who immediately commented on this, um, is not somebody who's going to jump up and down like the Z radicals on Telegram and celebrate Russian war crimes. He's more likely to deny them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other elements with links to the regime that are celebrating war crimes. So it's a plural picture. There is Putin, and then there is a series of sort of different floating agents. Um, some of them are less formalized, some of them are more formalized. The less formalized ones tend to celebrate war crimes more. The more formalized ones tend to deny war crimes more, but not always. Robert is asking, Russia has never won a war without Ukraine providing troops. How will Russia even make the status quo peace? Well, insofar as that's a military question, Robert, I don't want to answer it, but could Russia conscript many more people? Yes. Could Russia conscript more people than Ukraine could? Yes, it can. It can. Um, so um, the status quo at the moment is something that Ukraine is going to try to break. And we're going to be watching how that happens. But I don't think there are many experts who think that Ukraine is obviously going to break the status quo. Actually, I think that there's many experts who are hopeful about this, but that's not obvious. So I'm afraid that the status quo is something we want to avoid at the moment very much, and we want to avoid it partly because it looks more likely than we want it to be, quite frankly. But there is no problem with continuing this war for quite a while for Russia that I'm aware of. Um, if there's a military analysis that contradicts what I'm saying, obviously I welcome it. I mean, really welcome it in more than one way. Um, yeah, I will do a little update on Prigozhin's situation. For some reason, he's a sort of a figure of kind of dark energies that thrill people, and everybody wants to know what his motives are and what his status is every month of the year. Sanad is saying, what do you make of Lula's statements about the war? Is this limited to Brazil, or do you think this is now a general trend in non-Western countries? Well, look, the crisis we've got is that too many countries around the world don't have enough of an incentive to support Ukraine. And I think that creates a real conversation for us about how we have an international arrangement where that's so. Um, and what it might mean to change it and to bring it about that more countries around the world are going to be interested in the kind of project that the West is engaging in by supporting Ukraine, but that means that they've got to benefit from it more perhaps than they're benefiting at the moment. But some of it is also just ideology. Um, I do think that it's very important to recognize just how many countries in the world are neutral and what that says about global arrangements. In other words, it's no good going around, maligning countries around the world for not being on the right side of this. Um, how has it come about that that's how their incentives are structured? Mesita Soda is asking your thoughts on why Putin has refused to retire from power. Um, he'd be afraid he'd die if he left. He's described as a gangster, so what kept him from retiring to Sochi? So that's actually a good question because my reading of Putin, I've been following him closely since the 90s. And my reading of Putin is that he had a fantasy of retiring to somewhere like Sochi. Um, and sort of running the country with one hand at the wheel, perhaps having some kind of other tyrant in power, and Putin sort of being the honorary father of the country. And then at some point, he came to the decision that it was impossible to step away, that the kind of projects he wanted to realize wouldn't work. His desire to keep the regime in power and his desire to change the international order, and then also his desire for safety after office, because he has absolutely no procedure for a transit of power. He, for many years now, has felt that it would just not be safe for him to leave power until he absolutely had to take that risk. Dr. Paul Watson is thanking me, and I thank you in response with my gratitude. CS79N is asking, regarding the new conscription laws and border closure, is your feeling that those Russians who want to leave have left now, or might there be a second exodus wave? Well, now there's going to be a problem with an exodus wave because of the fact that once you're on the register, you're pretty much in trouble unless you immediately run to the border. You might get away. I think there could be like a 7-day window there for the border will be closed for you. The basic situation is that the majority of Russians are still part of that blob that we endlessly talk about. So what are they thinking? They're thinking, this is really bad, but what percentage of the population is going to affect? I mean, what is he going to conscript 5 million people? He's not going to conscript 5 million people. So hopefully this won't affect us. Um, and so how many more people run away in part depends on how many more people wake up from that slumber, right? And then you have to realize that there are all of these people who may want to leave but can't because they've got sick parents or they've got some other challenge and you just can't go. But the people who were clearly set on leaving have, to a good extent, and who could leave, have to a good extent left. And then if you look at disadvantaged Russians, leaving the country for them, I mean, this is not France. Leaving the country for them is like you and I going to the moon. I mean, that's what that would feel like to somebody in a small township in remote Russia. So for the most disadvantaged folks, that's not an option, as it were. I mean, it's sort of theoretically an option, but it's not practically an option. They're too burdened by social disadvantage for that to be really actually routinely available to them. But then there are a lot of people still in Moscow who could leave, but who are thinking it won't affect them, and they're not leaving. And if they feel that they're going to be affected, then they would start running, and then that could be another wave. I'm just going to check if I have missed somebody out. And Dan, I'm sorry if I mispronounced you. I don't know if you're Dana or Dana. So let us have a look. Zane is saying, what do you think about Gerasimov and Patrushev trying to sabotage Putin as is shown in the leaks? As it's shown in the leaks? Where did that information come from? Could it have come from uh, Telegram channels? So I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if Gerasimov was not thrilled with the idea of the war. But we've got to be careful about that. So, some of what we've seen there is a product of signals intelligence, other kinds of reliable approaches, but I'd want to make sure where that's come from, and I'm not sure that that story about Gerasimov being against the war, however plausible or implausible we think that is, comes from a sound source. I might dig into that a bit more deeply. Marv is saying the awful war crime seems different from other atrocities, considering they opened a formal investigation. Well, that's the bit of political technology. I mean, investigation doesn't mean anything. There is no there's no investigation that is going to clash with the Kremlin's calculation of what politically benefits it. Kalimakas is saying, is it a good idea to point out the fallacies in the Russian myth of being the defender of civilization when conversing with Russians, especially in World War II? I think what is constructive is to try to remove all of that toxic trash that the Russians have hung on top of their World War II myths, right? Because if you speak to actual Russian World War II vets, they're going to say never again, right? Whereas current Russian propaganda says we'll repeat it. So current Russian propaganda mythologization of the Second World War is completely incompatible with what actual folks who survived, right, and lost so many, so many millions, I will say. And actually now in Russia, you're probably as likely to see a sort of a label on the car saying to Berlin, we can repeat it, as you are to see the letter Z that's not very popular. So you'd start by basically trying to go back to that you might question the original myth too, but the first step would be just to go back to the original myth before it was soaked with this we can repeat it propaganda story. Sven is asking, why don't people in Crimea leave? Well, a lot of people have left, right? But I read a fascinating statistic, almost worthy a little chat on the chat channel, coming out from the Russian authorities. So it must be an exaggeration. The 3 million Russians are planning to go on holiday in Crimea this summer. And I'm sure that it's not that number, but it's going to be a high number still. Russians are going to go to Crimea on holiday. And So there. And it's going to be two psychologies. It's not just going to be Z patriots who do that. It's also going to be people who are kind of in denial, and whose trip there would be an affirmation of their denial of everything that's happening. Marv is saying, what about their propaganda push to give Russians justification? What I'm trying to get at is, why are they suddenly reacting to international horror? Okay, so you're still talking about that thing. I mean, there is the thought for the Kremlin that they don't want to look bad in front of non-Western countries beyond what is minimally necessary. RLW Designs is saying, is that politicized group fairly evenly distributed across Russian ethnic groups? People are talked about in the news. They talked about monolithically. I'm curious what gets missed. So the key demographic difference there is age, not ethnicity and not economic status. Age is bigger than any other factor. No, I'm so sorry. I've completely misread your question. I just assumed for a second that we were talking about the people who support the war. You're saying, what is the demographic split of that depoliticized blob in the middle? My guess, not the radical. So my guess is that the poorest, and the most ethnically diverse citizens are gonna be more prone to disliking the war. It's very difficult to interpret polls about who stands where in Russia, as we've discussed many times. But my instinct is that the worst of people in society are a little bit more worried about what is going on, partly because they think that it's going to disadvantage them, not because they think that Ukraine needs to be saved from this brutal violence. As far as people morally waking up from that depoliticized blob, then these are the wealthy, more urban people who could wake up morally, if you like. And that already is, these are folks that largely constitute the anti-war camp. So if we're talking about folks morally waking up from the depoliticized blob, it's gonna be the folks who are more privileged and urban. And if we're going and perhaps more ethnically Russian, and if we're going to talk about people just not liking the war increasingly because it's going against them, then there's a risk that these are going to be the worst off and the most ethnically diverse folks. But what you have to remember is that in most of these regions of Russia, that in Western media are often portrayed as being ethnically particular, in most of these regions, it's still the case that most folks there are ethnically Russian, right? With a few exceptions, 2+ exceptions, I think. So that's a slight ramble on that, but everything I say here is low confidence. DMG, thank you so much. Ohms, thank you. Marv, I don't think the Russians are covering up atrocities because they think they will lose horribly. Mr. Putin does not think he's going to lose. I mean, he just doesn't think that. Alexander, thank you for your content over the past year. Lots of love, and complicating your economy of sentiment. Yes, I am very grateful that you say that. Christian is saying, what would likely come of Russia's strategy should Putin die in office prior to the end of the war? Well, interestingly, Mr. Dugin has written an article about this. Um, and it's another brave article of Mr. Dugin's, and maybe even be worth discussing. He has really opened up the possibility of a post-Putin future. And he is talking about how Putin is a kind of a necessary but somewhat feeble moderate who needs to be replaced by a proper dictator who is going to be a sort of a writ large version of Putin. So there's only limited politicization of that post-Putin space at the moment, and that's what the problem is. The Russian opposition is facing that as a problem to a very great extent. They are struggling to politicize a post-Putin future. They're too much at risk of winning moral victories on Twitter. So there's a real need, except the folks who are in jail, of course, but there's a real need to politicize what comes after Putin. So the answer to your question, therefore, is dependent on what people do in the months and years that Putin still has in power. But if Putin disappeared tomorrow, then formally the power would pass to the prime minister. But in effect, there could be a kind of a rule by committee. And if that happened tomorrow, my instinct would be they would want to wind down the war. But it's possible that that wouldn't be the line if it happened 12 months from now or 2 years from now, because things change. There's certainly a possibility for a very radical junta to come to power after Putin, but then there'd be questions about its stability, how long it could hold on to power. Let's have a look. Bridget, thank you so much. You're hoping that Vlad gets taken out. But I think it's the other one, not me. Interestingly, he's not Vlad. Vladimir is not abbreviated to Vlad in Russian. So Vladimir Putin is I don't think he'd ever been called Vlad in his life. He's called Volodya or Vova. Vincent is asking about this registry. No, it's not. It's yes. Presumably, you'd need you need. Now, Vincent, I don't know how you log into this register. You may not need. You presumably would need an email to log into it. Yes, but there are a lot of people who will not know about it, will not know how to log into it. And the point is that they are going to be still conscripted, whether they know it or not. And they're gonna have the restrictions imposed on them if they don't act. Marv, I think, what I would say is that there are a lot of middle ranking people in the regime who are concerned about the ICCC story. And the ICC story. It's a very stressful thing. Even if you're living under a tyrant who would, not give you out, it's a very stressful thing to be pursued by the ICC. So none of them would want that, particularly the more junior figures. So I agree with you. It's going to have an effect. So not even sure this. Not even sure I'm pulling in the opposite direction to you. Stika Eric is saying, what do you make of Girkin, also known as Strelkov, being investigated and perhaps shut down by authorities in Moscow? Um, Girkin is at risk, and Girkin is at risk of being disappeared or jailed. Girkin is not a completely independent actor, in my view, but the difference between him and somebody like Prigozhin in the informational environment is that Girkin has a real demographic, the same demographic that Dugin is trying to activate. You know, um, so this is a guy who can create real social turbulence because up to 15% of the population might listen to him, or at least folks like him. And so he is advantageous to the regime and annoying to the regime at the same time. And as the balance of advantage and annoyance oscillates, the regime might choose to get rid of him. Let's have a look. Robert, I'm of the opinion that Putin is not a politician in any way understandable by Western sensibilities. Rather, Putin is like an Iron Age king or leader of a rampaging war band. Now, if you understand politics, Robert, as war, then he is obviously a politician. But if it's part of your political vision, that a central political concept is the concept of political opposition, then that's a concept Putin does not have. In other words, when Putin takes to his opponents as though they were enemies, that's not because he knows he should treat them like opponents, but doesn't. It's because he doesn't believe in treating people like opponents. And he thinks that when we treat each other like opponents in the West, it's a kind of aberration or a kind of a facade. So, um, insofar as politics, when things go well, is a game where you and I play tennis and we're trying to compete against each other. And I want you to lose, but I don't want you to lose by bonking you over the head with a racket. I want you to lose by serving an ace and delivering a phenomenal drop shot. Um, Putin doesn't get that. He doesn't recognize that as real. He thinks that the only reason I'm playing tennis is like that with you is because it's currently inconvenient to bonk you on the head with a racket. And as soon as it is convenient, I'm going to go ahead and do it. So, as far as any kind of um, bureaucratically complex procedural pluralistic vision of a modern state goes, Putin isn't into that kind of politics. Jesse is asking your view on whether Russia will collapse economically or politically. Um, uh, Seems to have shifted from unlikely to possible. What has changed in your view? Um, so I think it's unlikely, but that is not my ballpark. I'm going to leave anthropologists or different kind of social scientists to say what's likely and what's not. I think it's unlikely, but it's obviously been brought closer by many things Mr. Putin has done. Mr. Putin's increasing diffusion of monopoly over organized violence, Mr. Putin declaring Australian. I mean, hopefully we're not going to come to that. Mr. Putin declaring Australia as Russia. Mr. Putin declaring Ukrainian territory as Russian, and thereby transferring the war formally onto Russian territory. All of that destabilizes Russia's odds of retaining its territorial integrity. And also, collapse means what? A little bit here and there falling off, or the whole thing breaking up into many, many different bits. Um, I'm thinking of how to present Alexander Atkins' view to you guys, which isn't necessarily my view, but it's a very important view because it's a very historically, sociologically rich account of factors that do point toward Russia collapsing, um, Russia separating. So I'm going to present that view to you at some point, maybe this year, maybe with him um, on. Um, in terms of economic collapse, it's just not on the cards at the moment. Economic collapse is not on the cards. Um, and the people who are talking about imminent economic collapse of Russia are not really connected with the realistic economic analysis of the country. They're dealing with 4 or 5 big facts and trying to deduce something from them. Um, um, we're going to chat separately, CeeLo, we're going to chat separately about Prigozhin, but what I've just said is that he's lost a very sort of big battle to the Ministry of Defense. But we shouldn't count him out, and we will chat about him. What do you think of the former Eastern Bloc? A lot of people here support Russia and Putin. It's illogical. It's illogical, but why do you think that is, DMG? Look, I actually think a lot of people in Eastern Europe get it, probably better than people in Western Europe get it. But this is what's going to be so crucial about Ukraine's counteroffensive. The better it goes, the more consolidated support for Ukraine will be. The worse Ukraine's counteroffensive goes, the more Putin fanciers all over Europe, East and West and Center, and North America will come out. So this is going to be difficult. Why there is Putin fancy all over the place is an interesting question, and I'm promising soon to cover one part of that, which is why the Western left is sympathetic to Putin sometimes. And perhaps we'll cover other blocks too as we talk about various kinds of crises of democratic deficit and degeneration in Eastern Europe and Western Europe and everywhere else. Sleeping Beauty. Good luck hiding those war crimes. The exhibit Ukraine Crucifixion Tribunal by the artist Anton Lohov. If it's still in NYC at the UN, it was installed at the end of March. Let you know how it goes tomorrow. I think I should consider getting some kind of software to make this a little bit easier for all of us. Jessica, thank you so much. Alexander, Ian, what do you think about the idea that some have suggested that the war is a proxy war between the US, India, and China? We've covered that at the beginning, so I think there's a way of talking about a proxy war in a neutral sense. I call this in part a proxy war, but it's a proxy war I support. And you know, I infrequently use the term proxy about Ukraine because I think it helps with some factors. It helps us understand the extraordinary difficulty Ukraine faces of you know fighting for its independence in a way that is contingent on overlap with the interests of a major power. So it's you know, framing it like that can actually be a very empathetic framing toward the experience of Ukrainians. But seeing it as a proxy war in the negative sense, no. No, I don't. I don't. I don't recognize that framing. I mean, for one, look at the extraordinary reluctance with which the West has got dragged into this. Um, but we will be discussing these issues again. how the different actors are playing here. And we're hearing now stories about Chinese components being found in Russian weaponry. Jessica, you're asking an amazing military question. I'm just not sure that I can answer it for you. How has the population flight to avoid the draft affected the possibility of good battlefield management within the Russian armed forces? Um, well, I was about to say lots of critical things about how the Russian army is functioning, um, but I hope you will allow me to be conservative and just withhold, because I really shouldn't do military analysis. Relative time works. How are you going? We've got a problem of many countries around the world um, uh, laying the blame for this war on the United States, and seeing it as a bit of both, and seeing it as some kind of anti-imperialistic gambit by Russia. Now, there are all kinds of ideological flaws with that way of seeing the world, but we also have to understand that we need to do more to incentivize different countries around the world um, to support what the West is trying to achieve here. If they don't support us, it suggests something about our international arrangement and how different countries feel excluded and incentivized in a way that we don't like, but is understandable, perhaps, given how they're thinking of their interests. Um, Ivan is asking me about the nature of folks in Moscow protesting against the mosque being built. Doesn't this undermine the Russo-Chechen unity in this cruel war against Ukraine? Um, it doesn't, because it's just not going to have an effect on you know Mr. Kadyrov doing or not doing things that support Mr. Putin's war effort, but it certainly raises questions about Russia's internal politics. It raises questions about um, the future of Chechnya, without a doubt. Um, I've often been asked, will Chechnya want to separate from Russia if that was the choice? But Chechnya is already in so many ways so separate from Russia that the choice in the future might be a kind of consolidation of the separation, or the opposite, rejoining Russia. Um, um, and again, what this illustrates, the mosque protest in Moscow, is that uh, protest is potentially allowed in Russia as long as you're not protesting against the regime. Trash0815 is asking, do you think diplomacy can be influenced by personal relations of the leaders of the countries involved? As with Gorbachev, Reagan, um, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yasser Arafat. After Putin, I don't think you talk to Putin anymore. I think you talk past Putin, and you negotiate with agents that aren't Putin. that might still be part of the Russian regime, but they're not Putin, and they could be there after him. Um, but if we're talking about somebody who replaces Putin, um, that is always possible, of course. And um, certainly with Gorbachev and with Khrushchev in 20th century Russian history, Soviet history, what you saw is that um, somebody was put in, and then the power of their personality created change that none of the people who put them in wanted. Peter's saying there's a downside to mobilization because these folks are going to come back to Russia, and that's going to destabilize the country. Absolutely. There's going to be a whole bunch of traumatized, disaffected folks trained to kill who are going to be able to participate in any kind of civil war like scenario that may ensue. Yorm is asking, is Prigozhin trying to eventually set himself up as a successor to Putin? At the moment, I would say no. He is still subservient to Putin. He is dependent on Putin. And what he's trying to do, like all of these folks who are floating about, is create possibilities for himself to survive the transit environment, the post-Putin transit environment, transitional environment. Um, and he wants to ensure that he has some resources that he could lean on to ensure his survival physically and his sustenance of the resources he has as well. So these are all sort of preemptive actions. David L is asking, as a student of philosophy and psychology, do you find any conflict in discussing geopolitics? I'm glad you do. I'm just curious. So I am certainly clear that it is in my lane to discuss something like democratization or democratic decline, whereas it's not in my lane to discuss international relations theory. But the trouble then is, David, is that it is a philosophical question what international relations theory can or can't do. And what states are for and how they act is one of the primary questions in political philosophy. Like, what is the state for, right? And why wars occur is a philosophical question. So, what I try to be minimal about discussing too much is sort of what I would call political hackery, whereby you follow the day-to-day minutiae of politics. And sometimes we end up talking about that a bit because I've been following a lot of these Russian figures for years and decades, indeed. But I'm normally conservative about that. So that's a fraction of the that's a fraction of the answer. So just to give you, another example, not even with geopolitics, but with British domestic politics that I follow closely, I'd be more keen to discuss broader pictures and trends, right, rather than what's happened in the shadow cabinet last week. Lorraine is saying there's a history note that in exchange for letting go of the nukes, US, France, and others were going to protect Ukraine. Yes, but that was a very weak security guarantee. Alison, something you've said has disappeared. I'm sorry. Zayn is saying, would the Crimean people welcome Ukraine if it liberates Crimea? Who are the Crimean people is the question that we need to answer before asking your question, I suppose. Certainly, there are many people in Crimea now who would not welcome that. Garrett is asking, why are you an anti-systematic political philosopher? Because obviously I'm going to give you a cartoonish answer. Theory isn't something that can be an end in itself. And so it's a good question. Where does the imperative to make a systematic theoretical account of ethical life or political life come from? Where does that imperative come from? Right? And what are the obstacles to that imperative? And so one obstacle of many is the old obstacle that Isaiah Berlin talked about, that moral and political values are not just incompatible, but incommensurable, right? And therefore, no account of ethical life could transcend this problem. In other words, no account of ethical life that said, well, these values are the most important ones, these are slightly less important, and these are the principles according to which we should live. No account of that kind is available or desirable if human values conflict in a way that we can certainly arbitrate by living life, but in a way that theory cannot arbitrate in the abstract. I mean, that's just a quarter of a 2 cents of an answer. Craig saying philosophy is more of an art than a science. Philosophy is certainly not um, uh, an art, unless by art you mean not science. It's not science except in those bits of philosophy that are on the border of the sciences. And philosophy is a very multifaceted thing. But certainly moral philosophy and political philosophy is not science, nor is it social science, and nor is arguably social science science. Ada is saying, can you tell us about the position of Lyudmila Narusova, the widow of Mayor Sobchak and the mother of Ksenia Sobchak? She is known for her opposition to conscription, particularly against mobilization of conscripts. So she's the only one, I think, who voted against this recent law, but she was there to vote against it. So, I mean, one's got to be responsible, right, if one is part of that system, for what that system is doing. And, to some extent, she can get away with, some critical positions because of her historic connection with Putin. Anderson is saying, how can we help the Russian people who have sunk into this sort of historic Z rabbit hole after the war? So only about 15% have sunk into the rabbit hole. It's sort of passive acceptance, passive acclimation for that depoliticized blob in the middle. That's 50+% of the population. In terms of the Z folks, um, I don't think they're the critical ones. The critical ones are the ones in the middle who are or aren't going to wake up and are or aren't going to take a certain position when they do. These Z folks are going to be there if Russia becomes democratic. They're still going to be there. I don't think you get rid of them. He was asking, do you think Ukraine can win the counteroffensive with Western help? That's a military question. I can't answer it. My position is that Ukraine is not getting as much help as it should, and that the counteroffensive is politically critical because this is a war that's going to be decided on the battlefield, not by negotiation. I think at the moment, many folks in Ukraine are not willing to forego any territory. But that may clash, just responding to a question, but that may clash with the outcome that we get. So we're going to see. Jesse is saying Jordan Peterson sickens me. I was such a big fan, which sucks. We've talked about Jordan Peterson a bit. We'll talk about him a lot more, actually. But yeah, his position on Ukraine is really the only thing that I've discussed so far critically. But we'll discuss the entire phenomenon of Jordan Peterson, actually, that I think has not been captured yet. And I've promised that several times we'll get there. Waffleman is saying, do you think any parallel can be drawn between the outsourcing of politics in Russia and general political apathy in the West? What a wonderful question from Taiwan. So here is the key difference. I don't think we have a crisis of political apathy in the West. We have a crisis of political trust in the first instance. So the way to frame this would be to say that there's an unbelievable crisis of the capacity for normative thought about politics in Russia. And the crisis is that depoliticized blob of Russians in the middle is largely incapable, and I've just seen it myself, largely incapable of normative thought. So, you know, Mr. Russian citizen, Mrs. Russian citizen, you know, how to make Russia a better country. I mean, you've got this guy at the moment. He's doing just a little bit of sort of genocidal invasion, really. I mean, but maybe there's a different way to go. And the answer is, well, make Russia better? Don't know. I mean, don't know. I mean, I don't know what that even looks like. So there's a kind of an obstruction of normative thought. It just, as soon as it begins to go, just they can't think about politics in terms of better, worse, in terms of should and shouldn't, in terms of purposes. In the West, it's different. In the West, we do very actively normatively think about politics, but we've got very terrible at it. Right? We're doing it with a breakdown of the value of citizen belonging. We're doing it with a breakdown of trust, but we are engaged constantly in normative thought. It's not apathy to say the globalists have got me, they have got me, they have got me. You know, that is not apathetic. That is certainly a crisis of faith in the political process, without doubt. But it's distorted normative thought that should not be put down to stupidity. It should be put down to actual social forces acting on people. It's largely not people's fault, okay? But there's a difference. So Russians try normative thought and they just can't get anywhere. I mean, they're spinning, but the bike's not moving anywhere, spinning the pedals, the bike's not moving. In the West, we're just crashing into trees and collapsing and throwing the bike up into the air. And there's a difference. There's sort of distorted normative thought versus no normative thought at all. Vincent is wondering how many Russians would go to Crimea if there's no bridge. I don't know. I go to Crimea on holiday. No bridge, I swim. I'm a big patriot. There are people like that, unfortunately. Okay, beautiful community. You know what is exciting? I'm excited, very excited about my next video on the main channel about Russian, about imperialistic, about how to identify imperialistic tendencies in oppositional Russians. So that is going to be hopefully exciting for all of us. I swim like dolphin, Darren says. Everybody, thank you so much for joining me. Again, there was more of us. There's almost 1,500 of us. There's more of us than I'd expected at this hour of the night. I just want to say thank you very much. I'm now going to go and have a little rest and then do a little bit on the video. And I'm hoping to bring it out maybe on Tuesday or Monday if it happens really quickly. But I'm very, very grateful. Last question. Do you think that Russia is becoming a vassal of China? And if so, why? Yes, I think that that's the road that Russia is on. And even if Russia goes democratic in 5 years, getting on that road will be in some part irreversible. And what we're going to see is not just economic dependence on China, but China coming to take possession to some extent of Russia's foreign policy too. But it's a complex dynamic because on the one hand, China is in the superior position here, but on the other hand, there are also these myths about, um, China needing to be deferential to Russia as the bigger partner, and it's quite fascinating how this balances out on the Chinese side. But yeah, roughly speaking, that's a worrying trend if you are visualizing a post-Putin democratic Russia, because it'll still be on that path and it'll be hard to get off it. Savara, good night and thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for being with me. Profound apologies to those whose questions I didn't get to. I'm going to do many more of these. Lots of love for now. And good morning, good afternoon, and goodbye. I'm really blessed to have been with you today.